When Fractal Design showed us their Node 202 small form factor case at Computex this year, I thought fair enough, it's a neat and tidy little box, and that was pretty much my initial impression of the case. The thing was, I didn't get a look inside the box, so all I really saw is this kind of smoothish rectangle. Now there are two versions of Node 202. There's the bare case, which is a penny under £65 in the UK, or you can get it with their Integra SFX 450 watt power supply for £115. So the case 65, the power supply 50. SFX power supplies are rare and thin on the ground. At Computex, Corsair launched a gold standard modular SFX power supply, which I believe is the first in the world. There are a few SFX on the market. They're generally industrial PSUs, which are fairly cruddy and basic. So seeing companies such as Corsair and Fractal getting into the market, that's a good thing. If you're building a small box, you really don't need a great big PSU taking up a bunch of space inside the system. So this is a good thing. Now then, here is the Node 202. As I say, described as a small form factor case, mini ITX. The question is, what is a small form factor PC? Clearly, it's a lot smaller than a tower. No argument about that. On the other hand, compared, say, to an Intel NUC MSI QB Gigabyte bricks, it's relatively large. You cannot mount it on the back of your display in Visa. It has to either stand vertically like this or lay down flat. So this is the upright version, and if I take it off its mount and lay it down, it is like so. In the box of accessories, you get these 4 rubber feet. Take them apart, stick them on, so it's not literally sitting on its base. Let's take a quick tour around the outside, because there's not actually a massive amount to see. That's the front when the case sits horizontally, and this is frankly how it looks better to me rather than stood vertically. So we've got power button, 2 USB and headset jacks, a whole bunch of vents and such like, I/O panel for your motherboard on the back, graphics card exhaust here, your mains cable goes there, so clearly this is the rear of the case, more venting there, vent on the top which is above the CPU cooler, and on the bottom more ventilation. It's worth pointing out that the specification refers to magnetic filters, dust filters to go on the bottom of the case. I didn't receive those for some reason, so it won't make a massive difference cosmetically to how the case looks, but it will be filtered correctly. There's a filter inside there, which I'll come to in just a second. I've released the 4 screws that hold the casing together, so let's just pull the top off and hope it comes away tidily. There. Make sure I lift the right part. So both the top and bottom covers have actually got steel inside the plastic. It's very rigid, and if you put a magnet across it, it is actually magnetic. So there's definitely steel going on inside there. It means they're also quite heavy. Inside the top cover, there's this dust filter which clips in place. I find this strange because the magnetic dust filters that I didn't get for the bottom, which I can imagine exactly what they're like, I don't quite comprehend why Fractal hasn't gone for exactly the same idea on the top. The idea of removing a screwed on top cover and unclipping a dust filter seems to me a little unnecessary and laborious. It's the sort of thing, well, we've all seen inside very old PCs that are full of dust and other nastiness. We know how people neglect their computers. The idea someone's going to semi-dismantle a PC to clean it, it's not human nature, is it? Here's how the system looks. I built it with these components here. So a Zeus Z87i Pro motherboard, which is under here, mini ITX as mentioned, some Corsair LP memory, DDR3, Pentium Anniversary Edition processor under there, stock Intel cooler, that's part of the motherboard, that little riser card, it's sort of its VRMs. This is the SFX power supply from Fractal, which comes with this particular SKU of the case. Here we have an interesting graphics card, Sapphire R825. It's their mini ITX, as per that R9285 rather. I've missed a digit. And that's all the hardware. The case is split into these two halves, so motherboard this side with power supply, graphics card this side. The R9285 is a short graphics card. You could, if you choose, put a full-length gaming graphics card in there, although you do have to be a little cautious in the precise model you choose. So something like a GTX 980 will almost certainly go. One of the overclocked super funk versions with a great big shroud and all sorts of other stuff going on, such as the Sapphire R9290, I often use the tricks, is actually just a little bit too large to go in there. It's a bit too long, and I've also got here a Palette GTX 780, which fits in terms of length, but it's got a kind of bulge above its large fan, and that interferes with this sort of support mechanism here. So you can put a proper graphics card in, but you cannot simply install any graphics card that you choose. The power supply has connections, two PCI Express connections. You obviously cannot put dual graphics cards in this. That's simply not a goer. So the case is divided into these two chambers, which is presumably a thing to do with heat. In principle, not a bad idea. In practice, not entirely sure about this, because after all, most graphics cards, they expel air. They draw air through and then they expel it through the I/O slotted bracket. And that's absolutely great. It means the graphics card's chucking heat out. The CPU cooler side of things, obviously it depends which cooler you use. Now, as I mentioned, I'm using here a dual-core Pentium Anniversary. That's a G3258. Ordinarily in a PC, you might consider Core i5, Core i7. I've gone for the Anniversary because there isn't a lot of space for the CPU cooler. That is a bog ordinary Intel air cooler, and you actually have 56mm of vertical clearance above the CPU, which in the great scheme of things is nothing. Now, you can, with very little vertical clearance, often fit a liquid cooler, but of course you have to put all the hardware somewhere. Once the pump and heat exchanger is fixed in place, the radiator and all the hosing has to go somewhere. In this instance, there's nowhere to put it. I'm taking the idea of doing an external cooling thing. I'm just taking that off the table. So you might conceivably, possibly, theoretically consider with a short graphics card putting some sort of CPU cooling hardware over here. I'm going to say no, you're not. So for me, the fact that your cooling is limited on your CPU is an issue, but the real surprise here is that in the reviewer's blurb for the Node 202, Fractal says, the Node 202 is the ultimate PC case for those looking for a beautifully designed compact chassis that can house a capable gaming build. Well, capable, we can argue about capable all day long. If you're talking high-end, no you can't. If you're talking capable, can play games, yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's a reasonable processor. But if you're playing a proper game, and by proper I mean, well, you know what I mean by proper game, then in this instance, the processor, I would say, with the cooling you can mount on it, is going to be severely limited compared to the graphics card. You're going to get a mismatch, an imbalance. So yeah, you can play games, certainly more games than you can play on most tiny form factor PCs where you're relying on Intel graphics. Obviously you'll do better than that. However, it's not a gaming PC, it just isn't. Installing the hardware is a bit of a fiddle. Power supply is installed with this particular chassis. If you're using a bare chassis and you're buying an SFX power supply, you put it in place, that's fine. There is a cable running around from the mains plug on the back of the chassis, runs around the inside to here and goes to the power supply there. This particular power supply actually has a rocker switch, on-off rocker switch there, and then when the top cover is in place, it actually covers the power supply and the rocker switch, so you have to make sure you actually flick that switch first, otherwise the thing is going to appear to be dead. That's fun. So you're building a system, and Fractal's instructions are remove the top cover, obviously. You then remove the bottom cover, which is 3 clips here, 3 clips there, and 1 clip on one of these sides, either front or back. And you lift the chassis out of the cover. It says remove the cover from the chassis. You're really lifting the chassis from the cover, and that gives you full access to the innards. I wasn't actually clear why they wanted the bottom cover removing. It didn't seem to give any benefit, and it's also slightly fiddly. Power supply installed, motherboard in place. Then you have to put this little PCI Express riser card into the PCI Express graphics slot, and then you have to attach it to this sort of frame that divides the two halves of the case. That's a bit fiddly. There are actually 3 screw holes. There's one there I haven't used, and there are 2 here. Well, that is directly in line with the CPU cooler. That is directly in line with the memory. If you take out the memory, you've got better access. If you take out the CPU cooler and remove all the cables, you've got moderate access there, but it's not great. With the riser installed and fixed, you then have to put like a little riser extension which connects through this partition. That bit there, that's fine. And then the graphics card goes in, secure the graphics card, and then this sort of angled wedgie block thing, you slide it in place to support the graphics card, which actually works very well. That is completely rigid. And that basically is the end of that. Except this thing here is the drive bay housing. You might not have even spotted it up to now because it's amazingly discreet. It has one screw there, and if I then slide it, and it kind of lifts like so, and you'll see I have an SSD in it. So it hangs like a kind of saddle over this partition, one drive on either side. It works perfectly well. It keeps your drives out of harm's way. I'm not quite clear why they've chosen to put one drive on either side of the partition on the other hand, because it means that when you're connecting up your cabling, your SATA cables, your data cables and your power cables, it means that you've got one plug either side of this, but they're very close together. And that's something of a fiddle. Not the end of the world, it's just one of those bit of a struggle. It took me a couple of goes, and then I thought actually I'll just do a single drive just to make life easier. So overall, the build was like a bit of a fiddle, as it often is with small form factors, but the end result worked well. As I say, I didn't receive the magnetic dust filters, so my initial concern was that Fractal had messed up. Then I realised, well, they haven't sent the things, but the point is that they are included, so that's okay. So the top and bottom of the case are filtered, and that removable internal filter sits above the CPU cooler, which is absolutely fine. It is a fiddle putting the chassis into the bottom cover, in the sense you have to line up these ports, you kind of engage it and snap it down, but once you've done that you're never going to have to do it again, so that isn't a concern ongoing. It's a one-off problem, as is the business with the riser card and so on. You know, once you've installed the riser card, it's installed. I can't see you removing the motherboard in a hurry. Overall, apart from the odd bits of fiddle, the biggest single concern is clearance for the CPU cooler. During testing, when it's idling away, it's very quiet. Now, it has to be mentioned, this case comes with no fans whatsoever. If we remove the power supply from the equation, the only fan is the one on the CPU cooler. You can, if you choose, mount a pair of 120 fans under the graphics card, which I consider to be completely unnecessary, because after all, the graphics card is going to be flowing air itself. So the case has no case fans. When the system is idling, very quiet, say 30 decibels, but essentially silent. You won't even know it's there. Temperatures, on the other hand, reasonably high, but small form factor, this is always the way. 10 degrees hotter than a decent PC is about par for the course. 20 degrees hotter, no surprise whatsoever. It's just because it is. So the CPU was idling at 44 degrees, the graphics card idling at 41 degrees. Under extreme load, and I'm talking merciless thrashing the backside off it with benchmarks kinds of loads, the sorts of loads that is just totally unfair, the CPU, and it's only, as I mentioned, a dual core anniversary, rose to 61 Celsius, which is actually pretty cool, but that's because it's a competent processor, but nothing great. I think they retail for 50 quid. The GPU went up to 78 Celsius, which again is actually pretty good. But it's a small graphics card, it can flow air, that's all we ask for a graphics card. The R9285, that's Tonga, isn't it, technology, is actually quite recent, it works well, and it's a mini ITX graphics card, it's designed for this exact scenario. Happy with that. Noise levels, on the other hand, they kicked up 36 or so decibels, but taking the number out of the equation, basically, yes, it was very, very, very noticeable. but I was thrashing it, and I could hear the cooler getting hotter, and I could hear the fans spinning up, I could hear the graphics coming to life, but I was being brutal with the thing. Far more brutal than anyone in their right mind would actually be if it's their own PC. And that's pretty much it. The manual is your usual Fractal Design goodness. So line drawings as per usual, but they tint in blue the part you're actually looking at, so you know what you're talking about. So for instance, there we're looking at putting drives into this little caddy. There's the caddy, there's the drive. Here's the caddy going in the thing. Here's the little things you have to engage. It's as good a manual as you get. Now, I know some of you don't care about the user guide and installation guides, and I consider you to be wrong, but that's my personal thing. But when you have an unusual case like this, a bit of assistance, no bad thing. You've got riser cards to contend with. You've got a peculiar drive base setup here. You've got a graphics card support. Give me some help. Frankly, it was the manual that tipped me that I was missing the magnetic dust filters. Otherwise, I would have actually thought that Fractal had got things wrong. So, good manual, I'm happy. In terms of pricing, 65 for a small form factor case is perhaps a little steep, but no great surprise. It's certainly well thought out. The dual chamber thing, I don't actually consider it to be strictly necessary, but I can see what they're doing here. I consider it actually more useful. They can switch this graphics card to lie horizontally because they've got this sort of spine running across the case. They can then put the riser through. So I consider that to be the main purpose of this divider, rather than keeping the heat in one chamber or the other. So the case itself, well thought out, looks nice enough. £65, fair enough. Power supply, there are so few SFX power supplies on the market that really you don't actually have a metric for it. £50 for a 450 watt power supply sounds a bit over the top. On the other hand, it's an SFX power supply. It's very small. That's a very good thing for a small form factor PC. If you weren't building this system, you'd actually seriously consider using it in another small form factor. That's all to the good. So overall, the only actual gripe I have with this system is that I do wish that Fractal had included a pair of short SATA connections. In this instance, on this motherboard, the SATA connections are here and the drives are here. So a pair of cables that long would have done the trick. Now obviously the SATA connections could be elsewhere. A pair of SATA cables that long would be absolutely lovely. Would cost pennies, would make life easier. As it is, I've got these longer cables, standard cables, and they kind of loop around a bit messy. So there we have it. Overall, I'm happy with this case. I suspect that kit guru readers typically won't be massively interested in it because the CPU cooler means you're sorely limited on your gaming hardware that you can use on the CPU side of things. But there we have it. But that is almost the nature of small form factor. But in the main, the Node 202 it looks like a nice little design. It certainly has its place. And in the main, I'm quite happy with this case. It hits the mark, it does the job. So this is the award for Kit Guru. This is the Fractal Design Node 202 with Integra SFX 450 watt power supply.